Welcome to episode 45 of AuthentiCity FM. I'm Phil Corrali, here again with my great friends and colleagues, Corey Spiegel and Mike Sable. So we're wrapping up our summer series, and as we do that, we've been doing a little reflecting on where we've been, and we realized we'd uncovered something perhaps bigger than we intended. We started with a simple idea that reality is bigger than any one perspective. That called us to curiosity. Curiosity helped us see patterns instead of just moments. And patterns made trust possible. Trust helped systems learn, respect helped people work together, and last week we landed on coherence, the thread that holds when everything else seems to be pulling apart. And then something else became clear. Coherence isn't the destination, it's the infrastructure. Because once something holds together, the next logical question is, what's it holding together for? And that's the question we're going to be asking tonight. And to help us explore it, and a lot more too, I'm sure, we are so honored to be joined by one of the best in this business, Bob O'Neill, former executive director of ICMA, executive in residence at the Center for Livable Communities at the College of Charleston, city and county manager, thinker, and a truly inspiring leader. Stick around with us. You are not going to want to miss it. We'll see you on the other side. Bob O'Neill, welcome to AuthentiCity FM. We are so thrilled to welcome you. So thrilled to have the opportunity to talk this evening and to kind of close out our summer of learning and our summer of dialogue around all of those things that I wrote. And, you know, as I've seen you present some ideas over the last year in a variety of venues, there are a lot of things that tie together. And so I know you're going to have some thoughts to share. But what we'd love to do is turn the mic over to you first so you can introduce yourself, however short or long you'd like to do that. And again, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thanks for the invitation. And hopefully this may be the end of the summer, but I hope it's not the end of your series because you invited me. So let's hope it's worthwhile to someone who's listening. My journey began like many who are in local government management. I had no idea what it was to start with. I ended up being an intern between my freshman and sophomore year, walking into City Hall in my hometown of Hampton, Virginia, with a fellowship in hand and said, if you've got something for me to do, somebody's already paying me, so I could be free labor. And my father was in the Air Force and stationed in Europe, and the reason I was back in my hometown was because I had to go fix the house, which I'm perfectly incapable of doing, for them to return. And so I figured if I had a good job, they would give me a break on fixing the house. And so I ended up in the city manager's office at the ripe old age of 19 as free labor. And fortunately, there was a mayor, a city manager, an assistant city manager who saw something in me I certainly didn't see in myself at that point and gave me increasingly interesting assignments. And all of a sudden, I knew a lot about what I wanted to do in my life. And that was to be involved in local government because it was just so mesmerizing to me of the level of activity and the range of those activities and the impact in community. And I actually transferred so I could work sort of semi full-time and go to school at the same time. You know, I ended up running, for those of you who are historians, what were the public employment programs that came out of a lot of the post-Vietnam sort of work and for the city and a number of other sort of programs that didn't have a home, and you'd be the only person in the manager's office. So I got them, and they sent me off to graduate school. That was a really cool thing. And I came back, worked there for about a year or so, and then became the assistant city manager, pretty young. Again, somebody saw something that probably shouldn't have seen in me because I'm not sure I was ready for that. But nonetheless, that's what happened. And so I worked there another 5 years, and then I got the itch because people kept saying how important the private sector was, that I went to work for two large consulting firms and had an amazing experience. Probably as good at education as I could get about organization. But I knew that's not where I wanted to be. So my hometown's manager's job came open, and I went back to be the city manager. And I was there for 14 years. And then went to Fairfax County for 3 years as the county executive during an interesting transition period for that part of the world, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, and Fairfax in particular. And then I got one of those sort of out of the blue invitations, and that was to become the president of the National Academy of Public Administration. I know Mike's probably heard this story, is there could not be any more opposite a job between the Fairfax County executive and the president of the National Academy of Public Administration. So you went from 24/7 all the time to a think tank. I tell the story. I mean, it was a wonderful job. I got to work in the White House. I got to do all kinds of interesting things, but it was an entirely different environment. And, I tell the story often is that I was there, I think, 2 days at the academy, and my assistant came in and said, "You were going to have a really busy day today. You have 3 appointments." And I kind of shut the door, and I called my wife and I said, "I don't think this is a real job," but your job is to think, not to do, right? Very different kind of environment. After I adjusted to it, I loved every minute of it, because it was both. It was what I needed at the time. I needed a break from the intensity of the world that you guys are in, and I needed some intellectual stimulation in an entirely different environment, and I got that. And then Bill Hansel retired, and so it was sort of, would be kind of the perfect scenario, is to go to ICMA and be there. And I was fortunate enough the board selected me, and I spent 14 years there. And now I get to work with local governments around the country, but focusing a little bit closer to home at my work at the College of Charleston. So hopefully that was not too long.
It was exactly as long as it needed to be, because all of those things taken singularly would be fascinating to somehow push them all into a single career is a little mind-blowing, and it speaks to just kind of the breadth of the experiences that you've been able to have, and I think probably has brought you to the space that you are today, and the thinking and talking that you've been doing as it relates to the state of affairs, right? We've talked a great deal on the podcast about what it's like in the business, what it's like to lead in these times. And what I have heard you talk a great deal about has been this struggle, right? The struggle of finding civility, of recognizing the value of the whole in a world that's really focused on self-interest. And I'd really love to just start there, if we can tonight, and to kind of pull that apart a bit. It's very much what we have been thinking and talking about, and particularly leading toward community and community building and the infrastructure around this civic environment that used to exist and probably still exists, but feels a little bit hard to find. So I'd love to start there and get your thoughts just on the surface and run with it.
Yeah, I think local government. First of all, let's talk about that for a second. And the environment is that I've said this many times, is local government has never been unimportant, but it is clearly more important today than it has ever been. It's the last fully functioning level of government that we've got, and so the genesis of both innovation, solutions, and problem solvings is going to bubble from the community up, right? And so I think And then you overlay that the environment you just described, sort of an increasing lack of civility, highly partisanship environment, an environment where expertise and experience is often devalued. And in fact, sometimes facts are perceived to be partisan. And so I'm just reminded that we convened a group in 2007 because of kind of what was going on, and then what turned out to be the approaching, we didn't know it at the time, but the Great Recession and the kind of environment of the Tea Party movement. And, I think we're in one of those kind of inflection moments again. And so that I think is worthy of just stepping back and trying to engage. And I'm going to ask you a question here in a minute because I want to engage you in that conversation. Is how do we as a profession respond to this idea of partisanship, and facts are seen as partisan, and the definition of common good is quite different, I think, in many people's mind today. And so I think we as a profession need to step back and think about how we prepare people for that environment first. Second of all, how we support them in that environment. And third, what kind of innovations about the profession do we need to have? And what I mean by that is that I think a lot of us probably got in this business because we wanted to make communities better. We sort of saw the focus as primarily sort of service delivery. We get some resources and we provide public works and parks and recreation and police and fire and those kind of things. And I think those things will never be unimportant, and they truly are important. But what I think is most important is what's the role of the profession as being catalysts for reinstating and re-engaging around the issues of the common good. How is it that we can think about how we can shape the dialogue in communities where we can become the catalyst, the broker, the arbiter, some of those kind of verbs or adjectives that probably aren't in the job description that I think people envision a city manager to have. So I've been challenged a few times, and people say, well, that's the role of the elected officials. And I would argue, in many cases, the elected officials are put in a box that they can't play those roles. And so how do we connect the communities and spaces that are safe, where sometimes the elected officials can't create that safe place? And so, I'd be interested in the three of you, your reaction to that, because I think it requires a sort of different preparation and support for the manager. And it can't just be the manager. It's got to be the senior leadership group as a whole, sort of focused on that. And, I just got an email from Ben Thatcher, and I don't know if Ben's a manager in Texas, because he and I have been talking about that. And he's been trying to engage his community and to talk about this civic infrastructure. What's the infrastructure investment as a community you want to make? And then let me just tell one other part of it that I found interesting to me. And then I'm really interested in your reactions is, in the role I am now, I often get involved with, we're doing a plan for a school district, and we're doing a thing for the Chamber of Commerce, and we're doing stuff for a series of nonprofits. And every one of the leaders of those groups, business leaders, religious leaders, school superintendents, healthcare executives, all are talking about this partisanship and lack of civility. But we don't talk about it together, where we could build some synergy about what we should do about it in our community. And so who can do that, right? Who can create that conversation? I would argue the manager's in as good a spot as anybody else to do the convening, to do that. So I'd be interested because you guys are in it up to your nose right now. So, what's your reaction to that?
So it's an interesting reflection, and it ties back to more than a handful of conversations I've had in the last 2 weeks. So I live in Iowa. The state legislature just slashed property taxes. The headlines are pretty serious. Florida's got a ballot measure this fall. And I think one of the challenges right now is we are anchoring to the way it's been done, the world that we all came up in, the world we learned how to manage in. And that's not the world we are managing in or the one to come. And so I wrote down diverging diamond. I drove through a diverging diamond the other day for the first time. And the first time you do it, it's like, what on earth is this? And how am I supposed to maneuver? And then you drive through it and you're like, oh, that's pretty cool. And I think that's a reflection of where we're at, because we can say what the state legislatures are doing is wrong and we don't like it. And it's not stopping any of them. Because for whatever reason, partisan or not, they want something different. And so fighting against the change will be futile. That's my opinion. So then what do you do with it? I think of a conversation Mike and I had earlier today. We create community. One of the things that ICMA has meant to me, and IEDC and the other part of my life, is it allows me to connect to the people around a body of work who understand the experiences and the language and who hopefully I can help too. Because not everybody understands it. And trying to explain all of the crazy things to somebody in the private sector, and they look at you and they're like, there's no way that's real. And you're like, no, that's Tuesday. And so this idea of what is the role of, university programs, you're seeing a lot of the great public admin schools start to build bigger wraparound infrastructures, which I think is really, really important. But that is also the role of the professional associations, keeping people connected. But I think it's important that it's not connected to the past. How do we navigate innovation and change in the future? What does different look like? Because as we had Dr. Shannon Portillo on the podcast, and she, to your perspective on partisanship, she walked right into it. She said, this is the world. And to pretend it's not, or to say that the code of ethics, and I'm not saying the code of ethics is wrong, I'm saying it was written in a different era. And how do we look forward and not be afraid of trying some things? And to me, that's the important part right now, is community and not being afraid of different. Am I going to stop the people who say really nasty things about me on Facebook? Nope. There is literally nothing I can do to stop them. And I quit trying several years ago because it doesn't matter. And we've talked about multiple truths. This idea that I believe what I believe and nothing you say is going to change it. And so how do we change? You bring people together, you convene, and you start these little incremental steps about, just like what you talked about in Texas. Somebody has to start the conversation, and the conversation can't be rooted in, I don't like what they're doing.
The optimism I would give you, however, is that we have been through that at least 3 times in the history of the profession since its founding. And we've had the ingenuity and the perseverance to figure out how the profession adds value in a time of disruptive change, which is essentially where we are. We're in a period of disruptive change. Now, I will tell you what will sound funny in today's world, but I'm old enough to remember the profession having a similar dialogue about televising council meetings. That was the great disruptor. Right? You were going to, it sounds ludicrous now to suggest that might be perceived the way it was then, but it was. There were people who just thought that would be the end of the profession. And so, Corey, to your point, I just think your diagnosis is correct. And I think it requires a different set of support structures for us. But I do think there are lots of people out there who believe that partisanship piece and the lack of civility has gone too far. The pendulum has swung. The question is, how do you build a community set of values that rejects that is okay? Now, it may be okay personally for people to do it, but not okay in the public space where you're trying to do. And I tell this all the time, is I ask people when I'm in the classes like the Senior Executive Institute and all those things that I I do one now for GFOA's Leadership Academy. And I said, why was local government created in the first place? And everybody's, well, police and fire. And the answer is that's not what it was. The original reason was to decide what we needed to do collectively that we could not do on our own. It was building a community. And we sort of have to get back to that root. I think that's what you're suggesting is how do we go back to those roots and build the analytics and all the things that we brought as a profession to that discussion. But it's going to take courage because, as you described, you've got to get beaten up. But what you want to do is get beaten up where you've got a support structure of others in the community who are willing to stand.
I'm going to offer that this feels like a flashback to a conversation I had 14 years ago when I first met you. Like this thread kind of moves through the profession. So I always appreciate how you are able to articulate sort of these challenges. And so I'm going to answer your question with, I do agree, right? A manager, the city manager of the manager community is the best positioned person to convene a diverse group of stakeholders, whether it's the chambers, whether it's the executives, whether it's the school district, right? We share that common address. And so we're looked to as that leader. It's something that you have always talked about over the course of the last however many years, is this being the chief storyteller and the chief meaning officer behind some of the work that we do. And I do think that is one of those elements that if we can get good at being the chief meaning officer behind our work. The other thing I'm going to add, and this is something we have touched on a little bit, but I think is probably, I'll call it the fall series, is how important governance is going to be in the next decade and beyond. Because right, if the institutions are crumbling and governance still matters, how do we reshape that conversation? So I would love to get kind of your reaction to being the chief meaning officer, but also this emphasis on governance.
Well, I mean, my speech today always starts with every person in the audience ought to go back to their organization and become the chief meaning officer. We've beaten the meaning out of the work for a lot of people in the public service, both internally and from external pressure. And I think there is no more important function than to continue to value why people are in the public service and what value they create by being in it. And we get so busy doing all the other stuff that I think we lose a lot of what the value is to people who have joined our organizations. And so, I just think that's just an important part of what I think lots of people want to do, but don't seem to think they have time to do it. And they don't know how to get the time to do it, given all the tasks that are on their plate. And whether it's a first line supervisor or the city manager, just reinforcing why people do this. I'm glad we have Simon Sinek coming to Long Beach, because his piece, we spend a whole lot of time on the what and how. That's true in every organization I've ever been around. And it's an important part of the leadership function to make sure you get the why done well. The connective tissue part of communities, I think, is what we have to rethink. What's the connective tissue that brings people together around what they value in their communities, right? So, I think in today's world, and I'd be interested in your reaction when I'm working with folks today or in the last decade or more, people's identifications are around sort of issues and their cul-de-sac. It's not the broader sort of community as we tend to think of it in the work that we do. And so how do we build the connected tissue in a community so that people understand one neighborhood's success or failure has an impact on, and we're all sort of in it together. And that's again, I think one of the, sort of back to the meaning officer, I think creating the meaning of community and the common good is one of the real messages that we have to continue to proselytize. I mean, I think that's really an important part of the work that we do, is how important the connections in our communities are among neighborhoods and among individuals. So that's really hard for us to do, I think, because sometimes I think we perceive that again, that's the mayor's job or that's the council's job. That's not really our job. And uh, to Corey's point, I've said this sometime with some trepidation, is the manager in tomorrow's world is probably going to have to be the best politician in the community. Little p, not big P, right? You're going to have to read the room before others even know the room's there. And so that sort of knowledge and connection, and it's hard when you're, I say that my ability to read the community and read the room when I was in Hampton in my hometown, I could do it in 5 minutes, right? When I went to Fairfax, I didn't have those same community connections. So what I had to find was the people who had them, right? Who could help me interpret what was going on in a way that allowed me to add value to the discussion and hopefully the policy decisions that the board was going to make. And, that's hard stuff to learn, right? It's hard stuff to prepare people for. And then, how much social media criticism can you take, right? Well, I think you take it if you have a really good social network that supports you both in the community and at home, right? Or whatever your family structures are, whatever your friend structures are. And I say to people now, the first thing, when we do these leadership things is, you should be mapping your social network. You need to know who are those people because those voices of criticism are going to be loud, but these are the people who keep you with the true north, right? They keep you on the path and the support you need to stay on that path given the criticism. And so I don't think we do enough work around building that social network around folks. I mean, I think we do it okay in the professional context, but I don't know that we do it in support of folks who just moved to a new community and they're the new city manager. And how do we help them build that social network there that allows them to do the tough work that they've got to do? Not sure I answered your question.
No, that was perfect. It was really interesting. So you said a couple of things. And so, I just had a conversation with a manager in the profession today about that social network of being new to the region. And so, right, shame on me for not doing better outreach 6 months ago when they got in there, but we finally got connected and then sort of this reinforcing. So it's a reminder of the professional obligation. I am a little nervous, right, about having this community social network because I do think of all the pressures that we face, we sometimes forget that we need to be connected to our communities really strongly. But it's an important reminder that this profession is pretty small. So if you are wondering how to build a professional network of colleagues, make sure you come to our conference session in Long Beach. Shameless plug on Monday for our presentation on presilience, because we actually talk about this exact thing. And I know Phil's got a question, but I'm going to throw out one concept I want you to think about is we know that we do disaster preparedness all the time. Like we know there's going to be a natural disaster, we prepare for it. We also know in our professional lives that there's going to be some sort of professional disaster. How do we actually build the resilience and the sort of the stewardship of the leadership for a crisis when it comes? So stay tuned. That might be a future conversation, but I'm going to turn it back to Phil.
I want to kind of tie a few things that we've been talking about together with a couple of experiences recently that I've had. And what I think they underscore is that local government still has relevance, and we, because of our relationship to local government, have a responsibility to make sure it remains relevant. So we are in my community right now. We have a group of concerned individuals relative to historic preservation and what the village is doing or not doing. And we had a good meeting today. It was it's a grassroots organization. And what struck me is that they didn't come to us in spite of what we have not done or in spite of what we have done, they came to us to elevate their voices. And they saw value in a collaborative to this. They don't want to operate separately from what we're doing. They want to work with us. They want to support what we're doing. They want to carry the message. They want to be able to underscore that what they care about is being heard by the people who have the ability to make decisions about it. And therefore, they will continue to be supportive of process. And why that ties into your point relative to partisanship a moment ago, Bob, is at the end of the meeting, they shared, a couple of them shared that they have yard signs that talked to their mission. And one of the individuals who was there said, I didn't feel like I could put that sign in front of my house because that sign feels partisan. And it feels like I'm taking a stand against my neighbor who just built a brand new house. And I don't want to make them feel uncomfortable. But what can the village do to help make this issue less partisan and make this issue about our community and what it means to us? And it struck me in the vein of what you were asking, is that people don't want everything to be partisan. I don't truly believe that people want to take hardline partisan sides. There are certainly multiple sides to every issue, but what was interesting in that interaction was that they thought that we had the power or had the ability to lessen the partisanship and to make it about the community. And I don't know that we actually do, but it was reinforcing to me that we are a layer of government that is still looked to actually enact something that makes people's lives better, that actually has the power to, in some way, shape, or form, whether it's through convening of conversations, whether it's through building that connective tissue, whether it's, being open to hearing what the community is concerned about, we have that responsibility to be chief meaning officers in our organizations, but also in our communities. The meaning of the work that we do is not singular. It is collective. And that is, it just struck me when you asked the question that has just happened this afternoon. And I had this discussion about how people just are not, they don't want to be there. They really don't want to be there. They just want the issues to be talked about relative to why it's important to the community. And I do think we have that role. I do think uniquely managers are positioned, or not, to know the people across the community, to understand who to bring together to have these difficult conversations. And in many cases, we know those people better than our elected officials do. I have had a ton of turnover. My board I've been here 13 years. I think I'm working with my 9th convening of elected officials. So they don't always have that connective tissue. We do. And so when we can carry it forward, that gives them tools. It gives our teams tools. It gives the community constituents the tools to really find those paths toward connection. And it's a difficult space to occupy, though. And I think Corey's experience is a good example of why it's so difficult, and underscores your point. How do you build that community support around what you're trying to do and to make it clear that it is for the benefit of the community?
So, Phil, I want to kind of grab a couple threads. In previous episodes and in conversations we've had, you talk about toxic ownership. And as you were talking through that, I got thinking about there is an era of local government where toxic ownership over the solution, the implementation, any resident group could come to the city with any problem and it was the city's to fix, or the county, right? Whatever the governmental unit is. And I don't think that's where the future goes. I think the ownership becomes part of the collaboration because the government can no longer fix it all. Either the rights or the privileges have been taken away by law, or finances are going to make it impossible. And so I think about, in my community, conversations about animal services and animal sheltering, homelessness and unhoused populations. They're not one government writing a check. Like, those solutions do not happen that way anymore. And 20 years ago, writing a check was the solution for almost everything, at least in this community. And so I think the power becomes less about the ability to make the problem go away and the opportunity to convene people around these community issues. Because I can't imagine a resident who wouldn't agree that solving the unhoused population is a community issue. Now, there are a lot of people who are like, as long as it's not my neighborhood, I don't care. Back to your point, Bob, about the cul-de-sac. 100% true. And so I think that becomes this power to convene, this power to mediate is really part of the secret sauce going forward. So, Bob, I'd love your perspective on that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's exactly right. I have told every mayor that I've ever worked with or had a chance to be in the same room with, your biggest power isn't the budget. It's the power to convene. Because if you're the manager of most places, or if you're the mayor of most places, people are going to return your call. They're going to respond if you get an invitation. And I mean, here's my probably Don Quixote move on this is I think there are lots of people, if one could convene them, who would be willing to set up, not owned by the government, but owned by the community, developed by stakeholders, convened perhaps by the local government, a set of community values about what the public discourse should be like. And if you want to play outside of those values, fine, that's your personal choice. But this is the place and the way we will make decisions. And this is the way we will debate. And this is the way we will differ. And there are going to be people who say that's impossible to do. I think we've reached a point where that's not impossible to do now because people are so frustrated with the content of the dialogue. And in every community is probably a different set of people you'd have to bring around the table, and they would own it. My view is it would be next door 2.0, but it'd be owned and convened by the community, not by some third party. He may buy the technology from a third party, but that's not the way it would run. And that would be a place where facts could get validated, and you have a validation strategy attached to the norms of the group. And you would encourage the debate and dialogue, but do it under a set of, sort of conventional rules. There's a pretty great, I don't know if you read David Brooks's Leaving the New York Times sort of column where he talked about our lack of connection of the common good. But what I took away was the optimism of it at the end. It said, we've been through these periods before and we figured out how to move to a different plateau, and turned out to be mostly positive, not euphoric. It wasn't everything was perfect. It was, we moved to a different plateau. And so, the point I think for us is, get over the therapeutic part of complaining about how bad it is and to try to figure out what is the formula that allows us to take advantage of the passion people have for some issues, but to do it in a forum where that can be resolved in a way that produces the none of the above solution, right? I mean, it's not my way or your way. Maybe it's a third way that gets done in a way that we can all be. I know Mike heard this one before, but there was a guy who got the Nobel Prize who used to work at ICMA. His name was Herbert Simon, and Herbert Simon got the Nobel Prize for economics for a concept called satisficing. And satisficing is trying to find the place where most of the people can move forward, right? I mean, that's essentially what it is. And I think we've in some cases facilitated losing that skill of finding that place. It's, it's the enemy of, you don't want the perfect to become the enemy of the good, right? I mean, and so how do we continually make progress in a community? We're not measured against the perfection that I think sometimes the way the dialogue gets structured, it's perfection or nothing. And right. And so whatever their view of the world is. And that's not really what happens in communities because we all come with a different perspective.
So believe it or not, that is the second reference to satisficing on this podcast. True, and not making that up. It came up in an earlier episode, so I just have to acknowledge that is we are either onto something or we are on something. I'm not sure which. But you have talked in your time talking to lots of groups. You have these 10 traits of leadership that go forward. One of them is sort of to be the chief meaning officer. Can you kind of talk a little bit about when you talk to organizations, or you talk to mayors, or you talk to managers, what are some of those traits that I think are going to be maybe like they're underappreciated or undervalued, and sort of what advice do you give to the new manager? Like if you're gonna harness one skill or you're gonna develop one thing, do this rather than that. What advice do you give to the newcomers in this profession?
Well, I mean, I got a long list of those things, but I mean, the four things that I would say to someone who really is interested in this profession is, one, anchor the organization and your work around mission, vision, and values. That's the centrifugal force of organizations. You can withstand all kinds of disruptions and changes if you are anchored around those, because the essence of local government will always be the same in the sense of what our purpose, mission, and values are. The second is the meaning piece, is for those people who join and who want to be part of the public service and be part of a local government organization, continually reinforcing the meaning of the work. The synergy that develops among the group is incredibly important. Now, the two problems with those are the challenge is that most local governments have like 30 or 40 subcultures in play all the time. And so it isn't just having the culture. It's not just having the vision. It's not just, it's how do you align police, fire, public works, finance, planning, public works, blah, 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 right? How do you align those subcultures so they are additive and not subtractions from the overall culture that you're trying to create? And that is a full-time gig, right? It's a full-time gig. The next two are, and I steal this from my friend Jim Collins, is you've got to develop in today's world symphonic skills. You've got to be able to work in that catalytic role where you do not have command and control, where you can work in cross-disciplinary, multi-sector, intergovernmental environments and do it productively, where you can't tell people what to do. And so how do you build those skills in planning directors and public works directors and others who we have trained all of our folks to run the agency in a hierarchical structure where that's prerequisite, but no longer sufficient, right? And so you've got to be able to operate in that much grayer area where you're using influence and other sort of skills in order to try to get to the outcome that you want. And then the last is, it is storytelling. GFOA asked me to help put together their leadership academy. And one of the people that we have brought in is a guy who teaches at Arizona State by the name of Ulrich Jensen, who does sessions on charisma. And what it is that's kind of a catchy thing to get people's attention. But what he talks about is how to effectively build stories around data. And he does an amazing sort of analytical piece that shows how that makes a difference. And he's researched speeches and other things in order to show how you build a compelling story that brings life to facts. So if I was going to say to somebody, this is what you've got to be able to do to be successful today. And then the last one, this goes back to what we've been talking about since the beginning, is it's courage. I say this all the time. There would have never been a moment in my early career where I could have ever anticipated that library directors and health directors and volunteer elected officials would have to fear for their lives. It just would not have been possible to even think about it, much less imagine it could happen to you, right? And that's where we are today. So it takes courage. I mean, who wants to shoot the library director? I mean, but that's where we are. And so, it's takes courage to do what we do. And that goes back to the social network piece of being able to support people who make courageous decisions.
I think it also requires what you were talking about before, which is the reinjection of meaning into the work. As you've said, right? How the courage comes because you recognize that the work is important. The work is worth doing. Doesn't make it easy. And I think that's what I'm seeing. We've talked a lot on a podcast about kind of our young Gen Zers who are coming into the workforce, having this vision in mind that they actually have the tools and the ability to make things better and to build a better future than they are seeing right now. And we've talked about that in the context of our children. Also, being the ones who are hopefully going to fix all of the messes that other generations have wrought. And, but none of that comes without the courage to actually take it up and do so. And, I think that's where I love your whole concept of storytelling, because it gives meaning to the work, obviously, to speak about what actually is being done. We were always, my early years were focused not on telling stories about how great things were in the units of government that I was working in, but to make sure that nobody called or wrote a letter, because quiet confidence and competence meant that everyone was happy and you never had to worry about anything. We owe it to our teams. We owe it to our communities to underscore the work that's being done, because it tells a story. And I think it tells a story to those in the next generation coming up, that this is what we need you to do too. These are the things that are required, and you can do them. So I would lean into a question perhaps to you in terms of, when you think about optimism and being optimistic about the future, what keeps you optimistic? You brought optimism into this conversation at least 3 times since we started it. And, the 3 of us are usually pretty good at going in the other direction. So what keeps driving that optimism?
Probably 3 things. One is, some of this probably comes with age, is the United States in particular, but I would say local governments across much of what we know as the Western world. We operate in big pendulum swings. And at the edges of those pendulum swings are really uncomfortable. And one of the things that local government is about is a little bit about being the anchor that brings us back to the middle. And because, and you'll probably think I'm Pollyanna, but I rarely find anyone that I speak to says, I want my community to be worse. Now, we may differ vehemently about how to make it better, but the fundamental connection that people have to their neighborhood, to their home, to their school, is very different than the connection to the state government and the federal government. And so I think part of what makes me optimistic is we sort of in local government have historically found a way to moderate the swings of the pendulum. The second is I think we have a very resourceful profession. I think most of us work at places that are under-resourced, who have lots of political challenges, and we've managed to find a place where we can make the community better than we found it. And so, I think that sort of genesis of our profession is, I think our value gets additive when we get into these kind of environments like we're in now. And so that's the second piece. And the third is, I don't think the public gets it right all the time, but they get it right in the long term most of the time. And most of us have lived through, sort of the good time and bad time. I mean, I started in local government in the height of, now you're going to age me here, but I mean, in the height of the Vietnam War and civil disobedience. And I mean, when you were in local government, when I was a 20-year-old working in City Hall, where there were demonstrations and, all the time, and people screaming at each other. And, and we've seen that, I've seen it a few times, right? But we've always sort of come back to the middle, or a broad definition of the middle, to move forward as a community. And so I think there's a certain anchoring in a community. And I think there's a certain anchoring in our profession that suggests we can deal with disruptive change. It seems ugly and hard while we're in the midst of it. But I think if you look back and with perspective, you can see in almost every case, we've come out pretty much okay. Certainly haven't solved all the problems. Certainly plenty of them still there to deal with, but we've come out of it okay.
Bob, I appreciate a couple of the words you used. We've talked about courage in so many of the episodes on the podcast, and that courage is hard. It's very uncomfortable. Doing the right thing in the moment is rarely comfortable. And then last episode, we started to talk about influence. With technology, we've lost some of that kind of man-to-man contact of learning how to read a room. There are people who are innately gifted. They can walk in a room. They know who's quietly in charge. They understand the power structure, the person who's talking when no one's listening. And that's only experiential. We've also talked about the fact that this younger generation can hear things that we don't hear, because so much of their formative years have been on these voice calls and these chats, and they pick up inflection and tone in ways that we've always used faces for. And as we merge this very tech-savvy AI first generation into the workforce, they are going to solve the big, hairy problems because that will be normal to them. But I think we're going to have a little bilingual issue about what influence looks like, because we're going to be speaking different languages. I can know generally what these two are thinking because I know their faces. I am less good with audible tones. The kids are great at that. And so I think we're going to have this weird little mismatch. And how do we create a lane of influence that can kind of transcend that going forward?
Well, Corey, if we have the answer to that, we ought to copyright it and we'll all be rich. But let me just reflect on a story that doesn't answer your question, but illustrates. Long time ago, when I worked for a consulting firm, one of the clients was a large, pretty well-known large architectural firm, and so I got to know the CEO of the architecture firm pretty well. And I was younger than he was. And so one day at lunch, he confided me. He said, "I feel totally fraudulent." He said, "I'm interviewing architects who have learned all of their trade on the computer, and I still use the draft board." And so if we talked for a while, and I mean, he this was the ultimate CEO impostor syndrome, right? I mean, it was, and yet he a brilliant architect and ran a really good company. But what we ultimately ended up doing is reverse mentorship. he mentored a young architect who had just been there about a year. And that young architect taught him to use computer-aided design. And I think that's where we are. I think all of us generationally bring a certain strength and we have certain blind spots. The trick historically has been, how do we blend those two in a way that allows both of us to learn something? And, your description of the sensors, right, that people have, yes, it's very different if you've grown up in the digital world versus me, right? I'm on my third device to do this, right? So I could use some mentorship. And so the point of my story is, I think if organizations are smart, they will start thinking about dual mentorship and thinking about how we can blend the attributes and lenses of the generations so that the whole's greater than the sum of the parts. It's interesting to me is that we're starting to see that backlash both to the technology, whether it be AI or whether it be data centers or whether it be schools taking the devices out of kids' hands, is that I think there's some recognition that we've lost something in that. Now, I happen to agree with you. There's something to be gained out of some of that we do not want to lose, but we also can't create an environment where people can't read the room. Because I will tell you, just again, those of us who've worked with people who are the bull in the china shop because they can't read the room, it is not helpful in communities and it's not helpful in organizations. And so, somehow or other we have to teach that, just like we teach other things.
I'm going to offer, I appreciate your stories. I've obviously heard a lot of them. And so that little bit of a story. So we have talked about reverse mentorship and we've talked about the importance of mentors. And so I've referenced Tony Gardner and Craig Gerhardt and some icons in the profession that obviously really well. And one of the things that in my association with them, I got to be connected with you. And there is a story that you tell that I love hearing, and I have told other people this story. So, and you referenced it sort of obliquely. So you were head of the National Academy of Public Administrators, a think tank. You referenced the White House. For our audience, could you please share your favorite story from your time in that job? And tell it in as funny a way as you can, because I just have this mental image. I feel like AI could create a perfect imagery. So I'm going to put you on the spot. It's not intended to be embarrassing because it's very endearing. And it's also one of the coolest perks of one of the coolest people in our profession. So please tell us this story.
So Mike's story. So this was President Obama had just been elected, and so this was early February of his first term, and so I think I was at the California Association meeting on the West Coast, and my phone rings, and it's my assistant, and she says, "You've been invited to the White House. It's black tie. It's, so I'm thinking state dinner-ish kind of thing. It's like, oh God, it's boring." And so, so I said, "Well, I'm on the West Coast. There's no way I can get back, get there, and so there's kind of this pause on the phone. And she said, "Okay." So, I was not walking down the hall 10 minutes and my phone rings. And it's my wife. Basically, she's saying, "You will be on the next plane to Washington, D.C., or the consequences are far more severe than you can imagine." And so there I go. I'm finding the first flight I can get back to Washington, D.C. So we get there. I dig my tux out. We roll down to what is now a hole in the ground called the East Room, right? And so we go in, and there are only about 40 people there, and there are no tables except 3 standing tables like you'd have at a cocktail party kind of thing. So we're all looking around at each other like, what is this? And a couple more people came in, and then out comes Earth, Wind, and Fire out of this little stage platform. And now we're really all looking at each other and trying to figure out what is going on. And then out of the hallway, you've seen that hallway a million times, where the president and the first lady, they They come in the room. They're shaking. I have the photo right over here on the left-hand side of where we're sitting right now. A picture of my wife and the president. My wife just was a great fan of Barack Obama and Michelle. And so they sort of introduce themselves to everybody, and then they turn and the Earth, Wind, and Fire starts to play. Now everybody's looking around. Now what are we doing? And so Michelle starts dancing, and the blood is draining from my face. You can imagine dancing is not one of my particular strengths or interests, and so but it is of my wife. And so then Barack starts dancing, and you see what's that Will Smith movie, Hitch? So now everybody is trying to be Hitch, right? Do not be. And so yes, and so my theory was, all right, there are going to be photos of this, so I'm going to find the stiffest person in the room to dance next to, so I will look like I have some rhythm by comparison. So I find Arnold Schwarzenegger and Maria. And so we go over and dance right next to him. And I actually do look like I have, comparatively speaking, more rhythm than Arnold. And then Michelle says something, and then the next thing I know, there's a conga line going through the White House. And I look over, and my wife was wearing heels. She's 5'3". So with heels, she was probably 5'6" or so. All of a sudden, she's back to 5'3". I said, "Where are your shoes?" She goes, "Over there." So we have a photo of her heels underneath this table. And then we're all winding through the East Room, through the other stuff. And I'm thinking, okay, this thing's going to not last. But it was midnight, and we're still dancing the night away. And I would tell you, I missed it by one because the stiffest guy in the room was Larry Summers. And I don't think he's ever danced. So it was just an interesting sort of evenings, is one would put it. Yes.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that story. Like, we get to do some pretty strange things in our profession. We talk about, like, the strangest thing will happen on a random Tuesday. I think your story probably takes the cake. So I appreciate the little bit of levity.
Well, let me tell. Can I tell one other story that's just similar illustration? So I told you I started pretty young. So one of my assignments when I was like 20 was I was assigned to the mayor. So mayor name was Ann Kilgore, and Ann Kilgore was the only woman mayor of a city of 100,000 or more at that particular time. And so we're off to the conference of mayors. And the manager says to me, you're the staff for the Mrs. Kilgore. She goes so we get to Washington, D.C. We go in, and this is that era of big mayors. This is the original Mayor Daley, John Lindsay, all of those things. So Mayor Kilgore looks at me, and at that point in time, believe it or not, I had long hair. I was 20. I don't think I was 21. And so she said, "Bob, I hope you have a really good suit, because I'm going to be the only woman and you're going to be the only guy in long hair. And if we don't look like we belong, they're going to think we're the hell."
Okay, so I don't have any good stories like that to tell, and I appreciate so much the ability to tell a good story well. And Bob, both of those stories were incredibly well laid out. So clearly, you've had some practice telling them. But I want to talk a little bit just about your time with an organization near and dear to our hearts as in this profession, which is ICMA. I realized in doing a little bit of research prior to this episode that you became the executive director around the time that I became a member of ICMA, and I have on my wall my certificate. I don't know that they give them out anymore, but my membership certificate with your signature, and I look at it every day. And it's a bit ago, and the profession has changed a bit, the association has changed a bit, and probably I think the people have changed a bit. And I think about going to ICMA conferences now versus when I first went. My first conference was in 2005 in sunny Minneapolis. Um, a wonderful place to spend some time, so Mike Sable tells us, and how big these conferences have got, right? Lately, the last few years have been stunningly large, and seeing 6,000 people who all care about this profession so profoundly all together. I'm curious just about, the long view of where you saw ICMA as you walked in the door, and where you see it tomorrow, right? It's a huge organization with a storied past. We all have differing levels of affection for it, but we all have affection for it. And I'm curious about, your time and what you saw and what you experienced and where you see it going.
How long do we have?
As long as you want. Mike won't cut you off.
Well, it's been an interesting journey because not only did I get to be the executive director, which is without question the best job in the world. I said it's the perfect job if you had an airplane, but it's a great job without one. But the ability to just spend time with people who are really passionate, and what that did for me is reinforce the value of, and I used to say this to the staff all the time, we should have really great programs, but the programs are immaterial to the network, right? What we're trying to foster is that network, the connection among people who are one-off in many cases in their community. There's only one manager, right? And then, that connection of people who aspire to those roles and who are functioning in roles of assistants and department heads and others, that network is what is the real value. And so everything we ought to do ought to revolve around creating that robust network. And then what's the value that they want from the network itself? And I think to some extent, it was never perfect, but I think we made some really good headway at that. I think that's more important than when I came now. And so, I think the fact that you're seeing 6,000 people in that, or you go to state associations and you now see record attendance, is one of the good things in terms of measure of the health of the profession, because I think those things are indicative of the support that people need to be successful and that they find value in that network. I think there's a great deal now shifting forward. I think there's a great deal, and I think Julia and Chris Morrill at GFOA in particular have been at the forefront of this, of reconnecting. We did this early in my time, and it's sort of, I guess, dropped by the wayside, of connecting all the professional associations. And I think ICMA's in that, I think ICMA ought to be the leader of that connection. And so I think Julia has, she has so much on her plate at the moment, but I think has taken that as a serious aspiration to build better connections so that, again, there are more people in that gap between the political reality and what we're trying to do. And that we're building people with that capacity across the various professions that make up local government. So I think we've got a lot of work to do. I think we're close to having both the platform and the interest of connecting in real time a problem-solving network that is worldwide. What fascinated me more than anything is, no matter whether I was in China or, Slovakia or Japan, the questions I got from people who were in local government were the same questions I was getting in Iowa or Illinois or Texas. And the political stuff's different. The structures are different, but People want housing. They want to be safe. They want education. They want healthcare. They want infrastructure that works. And so how can we build a learning network so that, that great idea in Italy shows up in Peoria sometime in our lifetime, right? I mean, we should be able to cut that learning curve by a substantial amount. And the technology platforms are approaching that, but we still have to get the people in the governments contributing to that learning network, and that's still a ways away. It will take some work. And then the last thing, Life Well Run had its moment, but I think we needed Life Well Run 2.0 about the value that professionals bring to public service and to communities, and why there's a value added by having them there. And so I don't know what that would look like today, but I think we need a Life Well Run 2.0.
So this summer, I spent some time researching different patterns across different cycles. So the debt capital cycle, communication revolutions, like some really fun things that when you go back through history, you start to see there really is a rhyme. Since you've had the privilege of living through some cycles in local government, and I think we can all agree we're at one edge of the pendulum right now.
Mm-hmm.
As we swing back towards the middle, what are the handful of things that if you could forecast what better looks like, or what government of the future looks like, what are those things that it can be wishful, it can be realistic, but where do you see the opportunity over the next maybe decade to really create the version of better that we all want, both for the communities and for the profession?
That's a really interesting question. The first thing that I think about is that, I think we as a profession need to spend some time on the financial framework of the future for local government. That just the description you were making of preemption and work on the state and local, on state and local finance that the legislatures are doing. I think the framework that we now have is rooted way into the 19th century. And so, part of it is, I think local government of the future is going to have a different financial framework from which to operate. And I think that's going to take, probably decades to do, but I think it's going to come. The fallacy of where we are today is going to come to roost soon, and I think that's going to be a challenge for state legislatures, frankly, but it's also going to be a challenge for us. The second thing I would do is I'd love to be able to convince people to get away from the organizational structures that we've got, to be able to build around outcomes and geography rather than around disciplines. Because I think most of the work that people care about in our communities are multidisciplinary, in most cases multi-sector. And so I think our silos get in the way an awful lot. And so I think we've got to be more comfortable ourselves with less structure and more comfortable with flexibility. And then lastly, I think this goes to sort of the community nature of it. I think we've got to be more external focused as a profession rather than internal focused. And that means outwardly to the community. It also means to be able to work in environments that seem political by today's standards. But again, I'm talking not political parties, but political in the sense of trying to build policy solutions for things that really do matter to people.
So I want to mash your first two. And I've been a little provocative on the podcast about my opinion that the lines on the map that were drawn for the purpose of taxation are broken. And there is political hierarchy and emotional attachment to those lines, but they're not how consumers behave. They're not how corporations behave. And so you can choose not to answer this because it's going to be a fairly provocative question. But is part of the evolution of finance and the restructuring of government services the realization that the lines on the map that we are emotionally attached to have to change for the future?
Yeah, I can tell you just a particular example. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the geography, but when I worked in Hampton Roads, which is 13 communities in a metropolitan area, I mean, part of the work that the managers of that, it was an extraordinary group of managers, was how do we take the issue, let's say environment or water or transportation or whatever, and draw the boundary for that issue rather than look at it by the jurisdiction. And then how could we all contribute to making that issue work across the boundaries that were necessary? And it was a really interesting, I mean, first of all, it was kind of an intellectual discussion, but then it got real about how to do that. And way less successful in the Northern Virginia region about that. And for a variety of different reasons, but still made some progress on. You didn't get rid of the jurisdictional boundaries, but you looked at the policy from the framework of what is it was the geographic space that had to be represented in order to get that done in an effective way. So we got a lot of things done on water. We got a lot of things done on transportation. We got a lot of things done on specialty education, which was, I think, a real winner for the region where education was a real challenge. But and the example was there were some folks who were really good at technical education, and some of the other jurisdictions weren't. Why don't we leverage their strengths rather than try to replicate what we were not very good at? And there was a whole range of those kind of discussions around jails. So, my description was how difficult it is, though, is my description when I was describing it to people was, if we could keep it below the political radar screen, we could get rid of the boundaries. But if it rose to the political level, then it was almost impossible to get that done. So the managers were the vehicle to get it done because we could keep some of that out of the political realm. That probably would have been in the political dynamic had we not sort of created a safe space for the conversations that occur. But to your point, if we don't do that, you don't get to the outcomes you want because those issues transcend all the boundaries. And that's why I say symphonic skills are those skills, the quintessential skill of the 21st century, because you've got to work across all those boundaries. You may not get rid of them, but you got to work across them.
So one of the bits that we have on our show is we give our guests an opportunity to ask us a provocative question, because Corey's great at that. So what's one question that you would want to ask of us?
Well, I asked you the first one early in in our discussion. The second one, I think, is how can we continue to motivate young people to be interested in the public service when what they see of it on the surface looks very unappealing?
So I'm laughing, and I'm going to make Mike answer it first because he was actually working on this exact answer for our session in Long Beach. And by he, I mean he's co-creating and collaborating with the bots. So there's a little help there. We've all trained our bots very well at this point. But I love the question because this is exactly what we were talking about earlier today.
So Corey's did set me up. And so, as you guys know, I do no show prep, but I do a little bit of AI research. And so we were talking about our session on resilience. And this is this concept of in order for the manager to be to succeed, they have to understand that our leadership is something that needs to be stewarded, our decision-making capabilities, our abilities, our capabilities to wrestle with hard problems are not only just dealing with the chaos and the crazy, but also just structurally just defending our capacity to do leadership work. And so And this is the line that came up is the next generation is not reading our job descriptions. They're watching us. They're deciding whether this profession is one that they want to inherit. And so like setting aside this time and demonstrating what it likes to lead through chaos, what it leads through to lead a whole life, like to preserve my capabilities to do good decision making, to be a father and a partner and all of these things, does require us to sort of pause and like actually care for ourselves, and not in sort of a Pollyannish sort of wellness kind of a way, but like, yeah, the job is hard. And there are 50,000 cities in the world that are all struggling with the same things. Like, it's not that hard. Like, we're all in this together. And I mean, I don't mean like it's complicated, but it's not, it's like, it's hard, but it's not complicated. Like, show up, do the work, build the partnerships, build the relationships, understand the direction that the community is going. Like, no one is chaining us to the desk to do this work. If you don't come at this work with some level of like passion and enthusiasm, go work somewhere else. We get to do really, really cool things. And so I'm a big believer in this sort of training the next generation to want to do the work, because it's actually the thing that matters. Your level, your ability to impact a generation or two or three, there are few jobs that you can go do that, and ours is one of them. And so I don't know if Corey, if I did anything to react to that, but to your question, Bob, I mean, that's kind of how I think about it, is like, this is a pretty cool thing that they get to do, and I get to get paid for it, and that's pretty magical. So that's my answer.
But how many times do you go to the state association or to ICMA and all you hear is the war stories being told?
That is one of the things that frustrates me. And I will say, like, so that is, I do struggle with that, because like, if you go on LinkedIn and social media, it's like, oh, woe is me. Oh, woe is me. And it's like, if you don't think this job is pretty cool, don't do it. Like, it is a pretty magical place that we get to operate in. And maybe it's a totally different mindset, but I actually believe that what we do matters. And it's not that hard if you're good at it.
Well, and I think the war stories are part of it, but the way I look at this is there's no way we can appeal to the next generations. And I would say it's not just young people. I think it's people coming in from other parts of industry that we can tap into, but it's welcoming them in. It's bringing them to a table and saying, hey, tell me what you love about your town. Tell me about what you love, a favorite third place. Tell me about what you want your kids to be able to enjoy someday in the future, right? And having the discussion around the fact that in this work that we do, that to Mike's point, we all raised our hands. We all stepped into it, and it's got its really tough days. I would say more days than not are easier than we give ourselves or give the profession credit for. We may not change the world every day, but yeah, I also like to underscore that that's not the point. You don't have to change the world every day for everyone. You can make one person's life better, and that's the work. And trying to distill it into a bit of the fact, this is generational work. The things that you will touch, other people will look at someday and wonder how you did it or why you did it, but it's still going to be there. It's going to be enduring and lasting. And quite frankly, it's fun. Being in the hub of activity and sitting in the manager's office and watching these operational structures work. Whether you're in crisis mode, whether you're in Tuesday, it's a fascinating exercise to see, to be in a space where we have the opportunity to shepherd something that perhaps somebody else created, but we are putting our mark on so that somebody down the road is going to grab that baton that we pass. And our goal, our hope always is to leave it better than we found it. That's by itself, to me, the thing that gets me to wake up every morning and walk into the office and not turn around and do something else, because I believe that it's the work that matters. And I think when we talk about that, I just had coffee with one of our summer interns last week. And I don't know that he's going to jump into the public sector. He's a finance major, but he wanted to learn about public sector finance. So he took a public sector finance internship while a bunch of his friends were taking internships at accounting firms and other things. And I said, look, I really am not going to force you to make a decision that you're going to follow and be in the public sector. But I will tell you that you have this experience that I need you to carry forward. And I need you to someday, he's a junior in college. Someday you're going to buy a house somewhere or live in a city somewhere. And your responsibility is to be a concerned and aware resident if you don't want to work in the public sector, because that's the other piece of this, right? The marriage of an engaged citizenry tied to an active and engaged unit of government that's serving them. We can do that too. We can train people to be better residents of their communities by the work that we do. And so I love it. I think it's great. I don't know that it's something that's easy to convey all the time, but gosh, if we're not welcoming people to the table, there's no way we tell that story.
So I think to the core of the question, it's kind of why we started this podcast. We had all seen the sensationalized version of it, be it on LinkedIn or wherever. And to the core question, what does better look like? Well, we wanted to create better. We've had fellows on the podcast. And if you go back into generational cycles, the young generation coming up, they have a role in how generations work, and they are going to be the stewards, and they are going to create community. It will look different than how we define it today, and that's okay. And so are there people currently on LinkedIn doing the same shtick every day? Yep. Can we change that? No. The joys of the First Amendment, we get to do what we do. But they will have a role. And I think being open-minded to how they view community, how they view service. I worked in government for 20 years. When we go back and visit Denver and Phoenix, I get to go, I planned that business park when it was just a cotton field and there was a dirt road. And now it's home to Microsoft. Like, there are few professions where you get to do that and fundamentally change place, and not to do it for profit, to do it for the public good and to be a steward. And I think that's what they need to understand.
So I think we have had a fun and wide-ranging conversation with you, Bob. You've been very generous with your time and with your thoughts. I want to make a pitch on your behalf that those of us who are all traveling to Long Beach in October should find opportunities to engage with you. And there are at least 2 formal opportunities to do so at the conference. You are facilitating 2 different things. You've got a micro certificate program on building civic infrastructure. You're doing that, I think, on Saturday.
That's great.
Yep, Saturday the 17th. That's got to register for that separately. Kate Fitzpatrick and Peggy Maris are both with you on that one. So everybody needs to sign up for that. You also are competing with us on Monday, which, as a member of the conference committee, I'm a little disappointed in myself here. But you are speaking with John Nalbandian and Jan Perkins relative to the promise of good governance, and that is 1:15 on Monday, the 19th of October. You can, this is what I always preach. People can go to multiple sessions that are happening at the same time. You start at one, you finish at another. So if somebody starts in ours and they go to yours or vice versa, that's not a statement other than people are thrilled to see really good sessions. And I think our conferences are just better than any other out there. And we're going to have some really great learning to do and some really great talking to do in Long Beach in October. Bob, I want to thank you for spending time with us. And as I said, sharing your thoughts and all of your ideas. Our shtick on the show when we have guests is to turn the microphone over to them for some closing thoughts. And I have no doubt you're going to leave us with some things to think about.
Well, the only thing I would leave you with is first to commend you on sessions like this, because again, it goes back to developing that sort of purpose and meaning for what it is we do and why we do it. The second is that I think there's a lot of more room for this kind of conversation within our profession, and I would hope you would continue to do it, because not everybody gets to say thank you to the people who do the kind of work that you do and your colleagues do. And this is a little bit of a way of celebrating the work and contribution. So thank you for doing it, but also it's a great platform to thank those who probably are listening, who get enriched by the reinforcement of the value that they create in their communities. So thank you for doing it.
I'm going to close this out by saying thank you. We are all a little bit in awe that you were willing to join the podcast. It's just so cool to hang out with you and hear from you. So to all of our listeners, thank you for sticking with us this long. This is episode 45, and we will see you at our next episode. Thanks.